Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you had a great lunch. So I wanted to talk a bit today about more about PFASs and how we regulate them. We heard some great talks earlier today about how the research that's being done to identify the fate of these chemicals in the environment or their impacts. But as you can imagine, because there's so many PFASs, it really makes it challenging to regulate them. And so more and more legislators and regulators are taking a class-based approach to PFASs. So I wanted to share with you what we're doing in California at the Department of Toxic Substances Control, specifically in the Safer Consumer Products program. So we regulate consumer products that contain chemicals of concern, and we have a pretty unique framework, but that doesn't necessarily mean that our work is not applicable to other regulatory frameworks as well. So just briefly, the way our regulatory framework works is we start from a list of 23 lists. So it's a list of lists, which we call the candidate chemicals list. And that includes chemicals that have been identified by these 23 authoritative bodies as having some kind of hazard or as being a great exposure risk. So for instance, chemicals that are found widely in biomonitoring in California are one of those lists. And we identify consumer products that contain one or more of these candidate chemicals, and we codify those in the California Code of Regulations as priority products. Now, what's unique about our framework is that we don't automatically ban these priority products, but instead the outcome of our regulations is an alternatives analysis. So we ask manufacturers who wish to continue selling this product in California to check if this chemical of concern is necessary in that product and if there is a safer alternative. And they have to show their work to us. They have to consider a lot of different factors. And based on that, we take a regulatory response. And so sometimes it may make sense to ban that chemical in the product because there are safer alternatives, but sometimes there are no safer alternatives yet. And so we have a wide range of regulatory responses that we can take, including requiring labels for consumers or administrative controls during manufacturing or end-of-life management, or even investment in green chemistry research to develop these safer alternatives if they're still missing. And we have the entire class of PFASs on our candidate chemicals list because they were added as priority chemicals for biomonitoring in California. And so the entire class is defined by Buck et al., meaning everything that has a CN, F2N plus 1 moiety is automatically included in our candidate chemicals list. So that's a few thousand chemicals. It's difficult to figure out exactly how many, but probably at least 4,000. But what we realized is that you can group these thousands of chemicals into four main subclasses. There's the perfluoroalkyl acids, which are the ones that we hear most about, the ones that have been most studied. But the majority of PFASs are precursors to these perfluoroalkyl acids or PFAAs. And so they fit in this bigger category of precursors. And these are the ones that are mainly used in consumer products. Fluoropolymers are also used in consumer products, and they are true polymers that contain fluorine in the carbon backbone, as are perfluoropolyethers, only that they also include oxygen in that polymeric carbon chain. So these four categories make it a little bit easier to think about this class. And so when we went to try to identify priority products, we have to basically show that there is potential exposures to a candidate chemical in the product, and that one or more of these exposures have the potential to contribute to or cause significant or widespread adverse impacts. So you'll notice right away that this regulatory framework is pretty precautionary because it's intended to allow us to take action even in the face of uncertainty, even when we don't yet know all the possible adverse effects of these chemicals, so that we can take action before those effects manifest. And for PFASs, the possible exposures are really complex. Consumer products are definitely a big source, either through direct human exposure or through environmental exposures, environmental releases. A lot of PFASs, they end up in wastewater, and there's efforts to remove them during wastewater treatment or in landfill leachate. But these efforts are really expensive and difficult to implement. And I would say they're going to get even more difficult if we don't address these upstream sources, which is what we are trying to do. And so we identified carpets and rugs containing PFASs as a priority product. We thought to start with carpets and rugs because they do cover a big area in our homes, offices, workplaces. They're widely used in California. They are a big percentage also of the waste that ends up in landfills every year. So they can be a pretty significant source of exposure. And we are also proposing to regulate as priority products the treatments, these aftermarket treatments that can be sprayed or applied on these converted textiles or leathers like carpets, rugs, clothing, or shoes. And these have a much more direct exposure route also for consumers while they're applying them, but they can also get washed off those products when they're laundered or at the end of life when the products are landfilled. And we're also looking at plant fiber-based food packaging with PFASs. And those are especially interesting because those products are designed to be compostable. They are biodegradable. The materials that they're made of are biodegradable, but the PFASs are not. And so adding these chemicals to this product makes it less likely for composters and recyclers to want to accept this packaging. So it's especially a problem for composters. They're basically not wanting food packaging in their stream because of these contaminants. And when it comes to adverse impacts, our regulations allow us to look at a whole range of factors, not just toxicity, because again, you don't often know the toxicity, but there's other things that you can look at. So we can look at a lot of different hazard traits. We can look at aggregate or cumulative effects, physical chemical properties and environmental fate, and even at the hazard traits and endpoints of the degradation, reaction, or metabolism products of those candidate chemicals. And if there are no data, we can also look at structurally similar compounds that have more data. In terms of this class of PFASs, the most well-established hazard trait is their environmental persistence. It's pretty clear that all PFASs are either persistent or they degrade into other PFASs that are persistent. So that's really a hazard that connects all of them. Many of them are also mobile in the environment, and many also bioaccumulate. And all those that have been assessed for this hazard trait were found to undergo lactational and transplacental transfer. But there's also a lot of toxicological hazard traits that have been identified, especially for these longer chain perfluoroalkyl acids that have been studied the longest. And now we're also seeing similar or even more hazard traits emerging for these shorter chain PFAS. They may not be as potent, or some of them may not be as potent as the longer chain ones, but they're still showing these properties of concern. And so there's also environmental hazard traits that have been identified, including phytotoxicity, wildlife developmental, reproductive, and survival impairment, which are some of these traits that we look at. So there's a lot of reasons for concern besides the persistence for these chemicals, but all the different PFASs that have been studied may show slightly different toxicological or environmental hazard traits. There isn't really one toxicity or one mode of action that basically represents the entire class. But what is common for the entire class is that they're all somehow connected to these perfluoroalkyl acids, which are incredibly persistent in the environment, so much so that they've been called forever chemicals, like degrading on geologic timescales. So these precursors that I mentioned before, they directly degrade in the environment into PFAS, or they metabolize in our bodies into PFAS. And that's why it's especially important to consider them when considering drinking water contamination, because we could be ingesting these precursors through drinking water or through food, and they may metabolize inside our bodies, sometimes through intermediate metabolites that are even more toxic than the final PFAS or more biopersistent. The fluoropolymers, they don't degrade into PFAS, but they are manufactured using PFAS, can contain PFAS impurities, and they've also been found to release PFAS when combusted. And same with the perfluoropolyethers, they may contain PFAS impurities, they may release PFAS during combustion. So the hazard traits of these PFAS are really representative and important to consider for the entire class. And it's important also, I think, to consider that the majority of PFASs are PFA precursors. In fact, about 80% of them, according to a study done by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, 80% or more may degrade to PFAS or metabolize to PFAS inside humans or biota. So it's definitely important to consider these PFAS. And again, the main concern with PFAS and those with the entire class is persistence. And there have been several authors who have argued that persistence alone should be sufficient for regulation if this persistence is really extreme. So basically highly persistent chemicals. And this is a quote from a recent paper by Cousins et al., where they argue that chemicals that are highly persistent, they're going to be continuously released into the environment. Or if they're continuously released to the environment, it'll lead to continuously increasing contamination. And so that will result in increasing probabilities of the occurrence of known and unknown effects, right? We don't yet know all the effects associated with PFASs, but if we keep increasing their concentration in the environment by continuing to release them into the environment, there may be more effects, decades from now that will show up that aren't yet apparent. And so that is a big concern with chemicals like PFASs. And that's why the Office of Environmental Health, Hazard and Assessment in California, in 2012, when they were preparing their green chemistry hazard trade regulations that form the basis for the safer consumer product regulations, they determined that persistence should be considered as a hazard trait. So basically giving it equal weight with any kind of toxicological hazard trait, because it's an inherent property of a chemical in the environment that results in increased exposure to the chemical and consequently potential for health risks. So that's why we are able to consider persistence as a sufficient basis for taking regulatory action. And so if you'd like to learn more about our approach, then I encourage you to visit or to read our paper on regulating PFAS as a chemical class under the SEP regulations. And if you want a couple fun videos, here are a couple links. We try to summarize our concerns with PFASs in a way that's a little bit more engaging than just a scientific paper. So I hope you enjoy these videos. And what's going to happen next? Well, as I mentioned, manufacturers, no worries. Manufacturers are going to have to submit an alternatives analysis once our first regulations get finalized. We anticipate to finalize regulating carpets and rugs with PFASs in the second half of this year. And then manufacturers will have to submit alternatives analysis if they wish to continue selling these products in California. And based on the results of their alternatives analysis, we will take a regulatory response. So again, that can vary. But if you'd like to stay in touch and see what happens as a result of our regulations, then this is how you can contact me or sign up for our e-list. That's a great way to stay up to date. And this is the website CalSafer, where we post all these documents and where we keep our public comment periods. So thank you so much for listening today. I hope this was helpful, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Simona. That was great. Janice, do we have any questions? Janice, you're muted.
Thank
I know
you.
we all do it.
Yes. All right. Do you know if the OECD data on PFAA precursors considered the timescale of transformation to PFAAs, or was it just an availability of evidence?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm not exactly sure what they considered. yeah, I don't know if they consider the timescales. I think they just looked at potential. And for some of those, there was no data, there was no available evidence. So it was more of a theoretical approach to, looking at the chemical structure and seeing if it could potentially degrade into PFAS. So it's still an estimate, but it's the best estimate that we have to date.